If this stirs you, please subscribe. Subscribe for more gentle ruses. Subscribe to cradle this wartime hush. Subscribe for more midnight histories whispered in the dark. Sergeant Arthur Shilstone crouched beside a kerosene heater while twilight pooled in the seams of his portable studio tent, his watercolor brushes soaking in a tin cup that still tasted faintly of army coffee. His assignment sounded like a dream from an art college prank: paint shadows onto canvas armor so the inflatable turrets would catch moonlight the way forged steel might. Each stroke rode the damp chill that drifted through the tent walls, and the rubber fabric flexed under his palm like the lungs of a sleeping animal. Outside, trucks muttered and generators clicked, yet inside the lamplight stroked the pigments into olive illusions, layering soot, ochre, and chalk so that a fake tank would wear battle fatigue on its skin. Arthur inhaled, vulcanized rubber mixed with wet earth, letting that chemical perfume guide the brush. He pinned color swatches to the tent pole, comparing them against charcoal photographs he had smuggled from art school critiques, letting memory steady his hand. His breath fogged in the air, dimming the lantern glass, and in the pause between strokes he listened to distant artillery like a metronome. He measured every highlight against stories from letters home, determined that any German scout peering through binoculars would feel the same metallic dread engendered by real armor plates. Craft and fear mingled in each bristle of his paintbrush, a tactile pact between artist and soldier, and the tent briefly smelled less like war and more like a backstage dressing room awaiting its curtain. The Sonic platoon parked modified half-tracks along a hedgerow glazed with frost, lifting heavy acetate discs whose grooves carried entire battalions of recorded engine roars, clattering treads and clunking couplers. Technicians aligned the needle assemblies beneath red-filtered lamps, the lacquer gleaming like fresh oil as they threaded cables toward loudspeaker arrays staked into mud that smelled of cold iron. Evidence of their craft lay in dials calibrated by gloved fingers, decibel charts clipped to clipboards, and the simple fact that microphones borrowed from radio studios now wore camouflage netting. They sprinkled sand over the speakers to deaden echoes, tasting grit when wind kicked it back into their teeth. Yet no one flinched because realism demanded discomfort. Backup discs waited in padded crates, their paper sleeves perfumed with acetate and glue, ready in case the main recording warped in the night chill. They rehearsed volume swells the way orchestra conductors cue brass, raising gloved hands as if unseen musicians waited beyond the hedgerow. A corporal tapped his boot against the frozen pedals to feel whether vibration would carry through the ground, making sure every note married texture with terrain. Yet against this instrumentation rose a contemplative hush. Could carefully sculpted noise bend an enemy's pulse without firing a shot? The men felt the answer in their rib cages as bass notes shuddered through the soil, proving that suggestion might be as heavy as armor. The air vibrated, owls scattered, and even the nearby cooks paused, tasting tin on their tongues as the invisible army rolled forward in sound alone, while somewhere in the dark, a violinist turned technician smiled at the realization that music theory now guided artillery. Inflation crews hauled black hoses over rutted ground, coupling them to compressors that rattled like enormous cicadas under rationed fuel. Air gusted through fabric stomachs, and in minutes a Sherman's silhouette rose, its final skin smelling of talc and warm glue. Corporal Lila Martinez, a seamstress before conscription, knelt to seal a valve with a dab of solvent that tingled through her gloves, and she listened for leaks the way a violinist listens for pitch, pressing her ear against the canvas flank. Nearby, a measuring staff marked the exact height the decoy must achieve, so that distant observers would accept it as battle-ready mass. She counted aloud in Spanish, the syllables puffing in pale clouds, so that the hose handlers could synchronize each burst of air with her rhythm. The hoses vibrated like muted bassoons against her calves, and the vibration traveled up her spine until her teeth chattered with the music of pressure. She chalked tiny arrows along the base to remind teammates where ballast bags should rest, and the chalk dust tasted bitter when sweat touched her upper lip. Each hiss of escaping air reminded the unit how delicate the charade remained. Yet the moonlit sheen on the Fate tank's rivets convinced tired sentries the job was worth the risk. The field felt both brittle and enchanted, as if breath could indeed become armor, and every exhalation formed a pale cloud that drifted toward the hedgerow like incense. Quiet weeds brushed boots in rhythmic whispers, brushing moisture onto trouser cuffs as though knighting the performers. The sand remembers, instruments hum, the hollow waits, night tasting faintly of cordite and wet paint. Reconnaissance patrols from the inflatable battalion walked the perimeter, carrying clipboards that listed the spacing between their decoys, down to the yards between fake gun emplacements. They sprinkled crushed limestone to imitate tread scarring, letting pale dust cling to their cuffs and scent the air with the tang of freshly fractured rock. Every footprint mattered, because German surveillance planes were rumoured to study tyre signatures the way botanists study leaf veins. The soldiers crouched in heather, mapping where to scatter ration tins, empty shell casings, and carefully stomped cigarette butts so that the tableau breathed like a regiment at rest. They also positioned battered helmets filled with muddy water to catch moon reflections, minor mirrors that convinced observers that crews had recently washed tools. Grease pencils traced arcs across acetate overlays that snapped in the cool air, and the graphite smeared onto their knuckles like war paint. When owls cried, the men paused to gauge whether the sound might mask their own rustling, letting nature collaborate in the lie. A reflective mood settled over the team as they worked beneath muted starlight, recognizing that war had transformed artistry into camouflage. Evidence glinted in the measuring compasses dangling from their belts, but reflection arrived with the hush of their movements, as if the earth preferred to be fooled gently. The inflatable army's success depended not on steel, but on attentive choreography of trivial textures, and even the smell of their own wool coats became another brushstroke in the landscape. Interrogations of captured radio operators later revealed scribbled maps pinned beneath lampblack in field headquarters, describing entire phantom divisions assembled where only swaying balloons had stood. The transcripts noted the scratch of pencils against damp paper, the smell of cheap tobacco smoke curling around telephones, and the certainty with which the enemy relayed the positions of guns that never existed. Analysts compared these accounts to the Ghost Army's deployment logs, testing each sentence like fabric stretched over a frame, and the overlap proved the ruse had bitten deep. One seized notebook even listed non-existent breach repairs, exactly where the Ghost Army had announced them over radio, proof that the soundstage had echoed far across the lines. Intelligence officers rubbed the paper between thumb and forefinger, feeling damp fibers that testified to the haste of enemy scribes. They even matched smudged thumbprints on captured documents to known staff officers, an evidentiary trail smelling faintly of ink solvent. Reflective whispers passed through Allied intelligence rooms. Deception had become a humanitarian instrument, diverting artillery toward empty meadows and letting flesh and blood battalions slip away under cloud cover. The measured success lay in casualty charts that dipped like soft hills, while philosophy lingered in the warmth of potbelly stoves where planners considered the ethics of artful lying. Canvas and graphite, not iron and fire, had shaken an empire's confidence, and the knowledge tasted bittersweet, like cocoa stirred with rationed sugar. The unit's roster read like a surrealist salon, set designers from Broadway, ad illustrators, sound engineers, and radio dramatists all issued olive drab uniforms that carried the musk of wool and weatherproofing wax. Their barracks buzzed with arguments about light angles and colour temperature, conversations punctuated by the metallic tap of tent poles and the mellow crack of ration biscuits. Technical manuals lay open beside sketchbooks, proving that every creative flourish needed the blessing of range tables. They improvised palettes by grinding pastels into enamel mugs, the powder floating up in soft clouds that perfumed the air like theatre chalk. Sec designers sketched stage flats with charcoal, overlaying them on battle maps to judge where silhouettes would play best against the horizon. On cold nights, they traded memories of marquee lights and paint, thick basements, letting nostalgia steady their focus. In that mingling, reflection bloomed. Art had been drafted to choreograph survival, and the gentle rasp of charcoal on newsprint became as strategic as a general's map pin. They learned to read fog, to time inflation against gusts, to listen as the ground soaked up rumours. Evidence, in the form of carefully labelled swatches, mingled with reverie about what beauty might mean once the war's roar softened. Their craft balanced on the thin air separating illusion from mercy, and even the bunkhouse lullabies took on the cadence of rehearsal cues. Outside a French village smelling of baked rye and coal smoke, the inflatable artillery array stretched along a pasture where cows watched with placid eyes. The soldiers anchored their fabric howitzers with stakes hammered into loamy soil, counting the beats between distant church bells to synchronize fake firing schedules with scripted radio chatter. They smeared axle grease on the gun trails so that dawn light would glint convincingly, and their gloves absorbed that metallic odor for hours. Evidence of their precision lay in the tables noting wind drift, muzzle flash timings, and the hour when actual guns would relocate south. Reflection tinged every exhalation. Would the villagers ever learn that their safety tonight depended on art students breathing life into rubber silhouettes? Lanterns painted a honeyed sheen across the decoys, and the scent of hay mingled with gasoline as generators coiled up for another round of facsimile thunder. A child peeked from a cellar door, hearing the muffled thump of fake artillery reports, and believing, quite reasonably, that salvation had arrived in steel. The village baker later confessed that he donated stale loaves so the soldiers could slice them into fake ration displays, even though he never learned the unit's name. The moment felt fragile, but the myth of overwhelming Allied artillery grew bolder, with each inflated barrel touching starlit mist, and dew collected on the tarps like beads of melted silver. The radio deception team huddled around a table coated in graphite smudges, scribbling chain of command scripts that matched the fabricated divisions now pretending to bivouac nearby. Typewriters clacked like steady rain as operators rehearsed call signs, building believable tension into the hiss of their transmissions. Signal strength meters glowed green, casting phosphorescent halos on knuckles, while coffee thickened in enamel mugs. Each burst of Morse carried specific references to fuel shortages, bridge repairs, and mess tent gossip, evidence meticulously aligned with actual campaigns miles away. They even staged overlapping conversations, letting one operator cough deliberately so eavesdroppers would sense exhausted men at work. Copper wire coiled around their boots, sparking tiny shocks whenever static built up from wool socks. Someone always burned a pinch of coffee grounds on the stove to neutralize the ozone smell before visitors stepped in. Reflection seeped in during the pauses, when headsets came off and ears rang with phantom static, reminding them that language itself had been weaponized into a lullaby meant to confuse. The air smelled of hot dust and ozone from vacuum tubes, and outside the fabric walls, night insects droned in accidental counterpoint to the human-made storm. In those brief pauses, someone always wiped condensation from the tent flap, as though clearing a theatrical scrim before the next scene. Far across the lines, German reconnaissance pilots peered through frosted canopies, noting columns that glimmered with dew and seemed to cast the weighty shadows of real armour. Photographs developed in field tents smelling of vinegar, stop bath revealed crisp silhouettes, because the ghost army had sprinkled charcoal along the edges to mimic the darker midtones that lenses love. Pilots jotted coordinates on their knees with grease pencils that squeaked against flight suits, certain the glint below must belong to armoured steel. Analysts pinched the prints with tweezers, evidence in hand, and rerouted reserve units toward threats that were nothing but air. Reflective unease haunted their briefings. The Reich had invested in mass and metallurgy, yet rumours now swirled that Americans possessed endless armour. Even the whir of projector fans could not dispel the shiver tracing their spines, and some officers rubbed their temples, tasting aspirin powder on their tongues. On the Allied side, the knowledge of this misdirection arrived via intercepted transmissions, each decoded phrase confirming that artifice had gained a strategic pulse. Cryptographers reported that the German senders' Morse grew erratic whenever they mentioned the Phantom divisions, as though doubt infected the rhythm. Breath drifted through command tents smelling of waxed canvas, carrying the quiet pride of illusionists whose success could never be widely announced. Mist curls, projectors whine, footfalls soften, frost tastes metallic, secrets ride the wind with gentle insistence, and the sky itself feels conspiratorial. Lieutenant Eleanor Abbott of the Chef Quartermaster Cell spent June 1944 evenings beneath a corrugated hangar at Gosfield, smoothing requisition sheets that listed inflatable Shermans, spare canvas ribs, and drums of olive drab dye destined for the Fortitude South depots. The ink carried a tang of carbon black, and every column she balanced whispered how long the theatrics could hold before authentic armor ferried across the channel. In their notebooks, soldiers described the sensation of guiding inflatable hulls along moonlit roads, the latex catching stray glints from windows still cracked by earlier shelling. One diary entry spoke of hands smelling of talcum and rope fibers, another of the faint squeak the material made when rubbed with wool gloves. They wrote about boot soles sticking slightly to freshly tarred bridges, about the taste of rain that slid down helmet straps during midnight redeployments. Another scribbler described onion soup simmering near the bivouac, its scent mixing with rubber to create a strangely comforting aroma. Pages crackle faintly today when turned, releasing the ghost of campfire smoke they once absorbed. Such first-hand accounts, now stored in acid-free folders, give historians tactile proof that the myths of invulnerable columns were born from sweat and breath. Reflection glows through those pages as well, because the authors wondered how future generations would interpret silent heroism conducted with props instead of bayonets. Their cursive, wavering with fatigue, suggests a lullaby cadence, as though the writers whispered to themselves while describing each careful deception. Evidence and reverie meet between the lines, where smudged ink still looks damp and faint fingerprints bloom like pressed leaves. After each operation, the unit dismantled its stage, folding tanks along creases still warm from afternoon sun, then dousing the area with diesel fumes to disguise any sweet hint of rubber. Crates thudded into trucks, canvas snapped in the wind, and the fake artillery left behind only pegged holes and the lingering smell of heated adhesive. Occasionally a farmer's dog barked at the sudden silence, nose twitching at the mingled scents of fuel and paint. Commanders insisted on a wall of silence because the strategy relied on surprise. Even Allied infantry rarely received explanations. Reflective discipline coloured their withdrawals. Secrecy felt both protective and isolating, as if their applause could never be heard. Reports were typed, sealed, and couriered under blackout curtains, the carbon copies leaving grey smears on wrists. Evidence of their success vanished deliberately, proving suppression was another tool in the arsenal. The inflatable army's footsteps fell softly, yet reshaped battle maps, and the empty fields they left behind seemed to inhale gratefully as the stage lights dimmed. Tires hissed on wet roads as they left, a sound like a curtain drawing shut. In that era, European farmland was not just terrain but a canvas. Hedgerows smelled of rain-soaked leaves while distant church organs muttered through cracked doors. The Ghost Army learned to treat every hill as a potential stage, aligning inflatable convoys along ridgelines where dawn light would elongate shadows into convincing proof of mass. Surveyors used clinometers, their brass edges cold against chilled palms, to calculate how sunbeams would clothe the decoys by morning. They also studied soil moisture, knowing that mud splashed onto tarps needed the right hue to mimic real grime. Acoustic quirks mattered too. Valleys that echoed church bells were ideal for bouncing recorded engines, so they listened carefully to how their own footsteps bounced back. Reflections seeped from those calculations, suggesting that nature itself could be coaxed into collaboration. Farmers who glimpsed the operations later recalled the faint rustle of canvas at night, a sound like laundry on a windy balcony, and they kept quiet out of awe as much as caution. Some offered cider in dented tin cups, the drink tasting of apples and smoke, then watched the visitors disappear before dawn. The landscape bore silent witness, storing impressions beneath wet soil, and the breeze carried whispers of starch, moss, and gasoline. Messages from resistance scouts carried notes about improbable armor buildups, scribbled in ink that smelled metallic and folded into loaves of bread still warm from communal ovens. Those notes, passed to Allied handlers, validated the Ghost Army's footprint because the deception fooled even friendly observers, unless briefed otherwise. The couriers sometimes pressed tiny sprigs of lavender between pages to mask the scent of ink, creating fragrant evidence that delighted archivists decades later. Riders checked their bicycle spokes before departure, plucking them like harpstrings to be sure no creak would betray them on cobblestones. Evidence glimmered in the wax seals and clandestine drops, while reflection rose from the realization that lies, when orchestrated with compassion, could save villages from bombardment. Couriers felt the paper scratch against their palms and tasted flour dust in the air as they cycled through narrow lanes. Each delivery reinforced the motif birthed in that dim warehouse, measurements and myths colliding until air became armor. Trust, too, was inflated carefully, and the night often closed behind them like velvet curtains. Between missions, the soldiers stitched torn seams beneath canvas awnings that rattled like distant applause whenever wind swept through the bivouac. Needles flashed in the subdued sunlight filtered through dust, and spools of thread rolled across tables, catching the smell of machine oil from nearby generators. They patched bullet grazes left by curious enemy scouts, smoothing adhesive with bone folders borrowed from bookbinders back home. Someone always kept a kettle steaming so steam could soften stiff fabric, and the vapour smelled faintly of mint leaves tucked into the water. Evidence of their improvisation filled toolboxes, spare valves, pigment tins, and the occasional borrowed phonograph pickup head wrapped in felt. Reflection visited in these quiet repairs, reminding the unit that maintaining the illusion required tenderness toward materials often dismissed as props. They hummed jazz standards, fingers sticky with rubber cement, savouring the calm before the next staged advance. Breath settled into their shoulders, and for once the war sounded like a sewing room. Canvas sighs, diesel purrs, knuckles warm, silence lingers, dawn tastes of citrus lozenges shared from coat pockets, and the rhythm of stitching mimicked a lullaby. Chemists attached to the unit tinkered with sealants under laboratory tents where alcohol lamps flickered, casting wavering gold on trays of viscous compounds. They blended new adhesives that resisted dew, stirring mixtures that smelled sharply of acetone and pine sap, then brushed them onto sample swatches hung beside hygrometers. They listened to the tick of condensation dripping from the ridgepole, timing how long each formula held pressure, and the quiet sounded like rain on a theatre roof. They also carried small tins of powdered silica to sprinkle over seams, feeling the grit bite their knuckles as they polished it smooth. Evidence of their breakthroughs lived in lab notebooks speckled with resin, noting which formula kept a turret inflated through a cold dawn. Reflection threaded through their precision, because each improved glue meant fewer soldiers at the front risked artillery fire. Wind pressed against the tent walls like an inquisitive hand, reminding them that the enemy was invisible yet ever present. Science and art clasped hands over bubbling beakers, and the chemist's sleeves carried the scent of turpentine for days. Once an operation concluded, the Ghost Army often slipped away under rain that tasted of copper, leaving empty clearings where engines still seemed to echo. Infantry units arriving later found tyre marks without weight, campfires without ash, even latrine pits filled with staged refuse. They sometimes discovered half-buried speakers, already gutted of their wires like skeletons of concerts long finished. Occasionally a stray dog padded through the clearing, sniffed the rubber scent embedded in the soil, and barked at the emptiness. Those clues served as post-war evidence that the deception had existed, yet at the time they simply dissolved into mud. Reflection clung to the departing soldiers as they glanced back, watching fog swallow the spaces they had animated. It felt like closing the curtain after a performance no audience was allowed to applaud. Each footstep squished softly, and the smell of wet canvas lingered long after trucks vanished. The myth of endless reinforcements continued its march, powered by these carefully orchestrated absences, and the puddles they left behind shimmered like mercury under rare sunbeams. In letters censored into anonymity, the artists wrote home about sunsets on camouflage netting, about the way inflated turrets caught rosy light and looked almost tender. They described the taste of powdered lemonade shared beside humming generators, the feel of charcoal smearing onto knuckles, and the odd pride in fooling reconnaissance planes. They also confessed to missing the sharp scent of turpentine from city studios, noting that gasoline fumes were a poor substitute, though they served the same imaginative fire. Some tucked tiny sketches between the lines, little silhouettes of tanks that censors usually ignored because they seemed harmless doodles. None could mention the unit's name, so they spoke instead of creating stage sets for unseen audiences. Evidence of their restraint survives in blacked-out lines and the repeated assurance that they were safe, even as artillery drifted nearby. Reflection saturates those letters, suggesting that secrecy was both a shield and a loneliness. Paper absorbed the scent of bore cleaner and lavender soap, a juxtaposition as soft as their voices on the page, and the envelopes sometimes carried pressed petals from borrowed French gardens. War Department memoranda, typed under buzzing fluorescent lights, stamped the Ghost Army's accomplishments with classifications that muffled them for decades. The paper felt slick with carbon ink, and couriers carried the folders in leather satchels that smelled of saddle soap and dust. Evidence of suppression appears right there in the directives ordering personnel to keep quiet even from fellow veterans. Clerks initialed each page with fountain pens, the nibs scratching like crickets as they recorded orders few would ever read. Filing cabinets slammed shut with a hollow, authoritative clang, swallowing the whispers that tried to follow the documents inside. Reflection shimmered in the margins where some officer penciled a note. Artists saved brigades, before the file vanished into storage. How could a story woven from air be told when heavy seals pressed it closed? The silence protected future missions, yet it also erased the tactile triumphs of those who painted, inflated, and broadcast in service of a ghostly army, leaving their senses crowded with memories no ceremony could acknowledge. During 1944, one elaborate feint near the Loire Valley layered sonic trucks, dummies, and radio chatter so convincingly that German armour redeployed overnight, chasing phantoms across mist-laden roads. Field notes described dew beading on microphone cables, the rubber smell of freshly inflated half-tracks, and the crunch of gravel beneath soldiers who pretended to refuel non-existent engines. Officers recorded the temperature, the moon phase, even the taste of the local well water, because every environmental clue helped keep the mirage believable. They also coordinated with engineers building real pontoon bridges miles away, ensuring the timing of fake engine noise covered the splash of actual crossings. Evidence of the operation endures in engineer sketches detailing where to park each decoy, right down to the angles at which headlamps should shine to suggest maintenance crews at work. Reflection suffused the team as they watched enemy searchlights sweep empty hills. The plan meant real divisions could cross elsewhere with fewer casualties. The valley tasted of wet stone and apples bruised during hurried harvests, grounding the surreal theatrics in agrarian reality. Measured illusions redirected lethal intent, and the mist curled around the decoys like curtains on opening night. To preserve the ruse, the Ghost Army sometimes staged partial destruction, slashing inflatable hulls so they would sag convincingly after scripted bombardments, while smoke pots perfumed the air with acrid sweetness. Engineers documented the cuts, noting how torn fabric fluttered under gusts, and photographers captured the aftermath to brief higher headquarters. They sprinkled plaster dust to imitate pulverized masonry, letting it cling to their sleeves and leave ghostly handprints on the props. Some even scattered charred rations and twisted canteen lids. Small artifacts meant to sell the illusion of calamity. Reflection lingered in those choreographed ruins, because the soldiers were both builders and dismantlers of fear. Ash settled on their tongues, and their eyes watered as they monitored how the staged wreckage read through binoculars. The lesson echoed through the unit: even illusions must endure believable suffering to maintain their authority. Fog drifts, seams gape, embers glow dull red, taste of soot, hush of cooling canvas measuring time, and the staged ruin exhaled a sorrow that felt convincing even to its creators. After the war, crates of deflated tanks languished in depots where dust motes danced through skylights, settling on rubber that now smelled more of storage than adrenaline. Inventory clerks stacked them beside surplus uniforms, the logs noting dimensions but not the adrenaline they once carried. Rust crept along the crates' hinges, and pigeons nested overhead, their coos echoing through the cavernous space. A janitor sweeping the aisle sometimes paused to press a palm against the cold rubber, feeling history without understanding it. Evidence of the unit's existence thus slipped into the bureaucratic background, hidden beneath tarps, as if the myths had folded into themselves. Reflection haunted the cavernous warehouses, because silence now stemmed from neglect rather than deliberate secrecy. Mice nested in canvas, rain drummed on tin roofs, and the once vital instruments waited for a recognition no one could authorize. Discovery had faded into storage's muffled heartbeat, yet the faint smell of talc refused to disappear entirely. A travelling quartermaster stumbled upon one of these crates and pried it open, releasing a puff of talc that perfumed the air like forgotten theatre makeup. Inside lay rolled-up turrets, their painted highlights still gleaming faintly in the dim warehouse light. He traced the brush strokes with a gloved finger, feeling grit where sand had once adhered to mimic dried mud. The canvas crackled faintly as it unrolled, a brittle applause that startled him into laughter. He jotted questions into his notebook, evidence of curiosity sparked by a relic that contradicted every training manual he knew. Reflection followed him as he drove away, windshield wipers squeaking, wondering why an army would archive balloons alongside medals. The discovery went unreported. The officer assumed it was a cancelled experiment, so suppression continued, now propelled by simple misinterpretation. The ghost stayed folded, its breath held, and the crate resumed gathering dust like a closed stage set. Decades later, a museum intern sorting photo negatives under the red hush of a darkroom noticed images of soldiers lounging atop inflated tanks, grinning like circus performers. The acetate smelled of fixer, and droplets of drying water speckled the frames, yet the evidence was unmistakable. These were not mock training exercises, but field deployments. She logged the negatives, scribbling a note that her supervisor initially dismissed as misfiled propaganda. Reflection, however, drove her to dig deeper, tasting the metallic tang of the rinse water as she processed more rolls. She began to overlay contact sheets on light tables, comparing landmarks and unit patches until the story sharpened. She even held one strip to her ear, convinced she could almost hear the laughter trapped in the emulsion. She labelled each envelope with the scent of the chemicals she used that day, a quirky shorthand that later amused archivists. Nights ended with her rubbing lotion into cracked fingers, the citrus balm mingling with fixer on her skin. Each emerging photograph expanded the mystery, suggesting a narrative suppressed not by malice, but by classification inertia. She imagined the negatives whispering to one another when the lights went out, their silver grains trading secrets in the dark chemical-stained air. Light gradually revealed the contours of lies told for life, and the darkroom suddenly felt like a chapel guarding revelation. A veteran once slipped during a reunion, mentioning the soundstage trucks over a glass of rye, whose caramel scent drifted across the hall, and suddenly a handful of listeners leaned closer. His words clinked like ice in tumblers as he described hauling speakers through mud, and the room's neon sign buzzed above them. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling fan, carrying with it the peppery scent of decades-old ration tobacco. Someone else nodded, recalling the weight of inflated half-tracks on his shoulders, and soon the air filled with the smell of nostalgia and aftershave. The dance floor nearby vibrated as a jukebox tune slid into a swing rhythm, and their boots tapped subconsciously in time with the remembered convoys. A ceiling fan ticked overhead, each wobble sounding like a mortar round landing far away, proof that memory can inhabit any rhythm. Evidence existed only in his memory, yet the urgency in his voice compelled others to corroborate with nods and half-started anecdotes. Reflection settled over the gathering, because they realized time itself might erase what secrecy had long buried. They lowered their voices as a matter of habit, even though classification had begun to loosen. Or, more than regulation, kept them gentle with the tale, and the jukebox in the corner played a ballad that sounded like distant engines. Researchers filing early information requests sat in microfilm rooms that smelled of acetate and stale carpet, spinning reels that squeaked faintly as ghostly text flickered on screens. The documents they received were riddled with gaps, but occasional references to visual deception units shone like mica in riverbed sediment. They kept thermoses of weak coffee nearby, sipping the bitter brew while eyes adjusted to the monochrome glow. Microfilm sprockets sang a thin metallic lullaby as they advanced frame by frame, and the rhythm settled into each researcher's pulse. Many rubbed their temples with menthol salve to stay alert, the sharp scent battling the room's mustiness. Some wore cotton gloves even though the reels were modern, honouring the fragility of whatever truth might appear. They counted frames like rosary beads, letting each image become a prayer for artists whose tools were brushes, not bayonets. Evidence had survived, though heavily redacted, prompting the scholars to outline timelines with pencil smudges streaking their fingertips. Reflection mingled with perseverance. They imagined the soldiers behind those censored lines, breathing cold air, shoulders dusted with chalk, lives wrapped in silence. Fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, and the chase for truth became as rhythmic as the flicker of frames, each click another heartbeat of the hidden story. One archivist tracked down a surviving inflatable decoy stored in a rural armory, its fabric brittle, yet still smelling faintly of rubber smoke when unrolled. He measured its seams, photographed the paintwork, and compared stitch patterns to supply logs, finally linking artifact to unit. He even pressed his ear against the hollow hull, hearing distant echoes of air rushing through valves, perhaps only his imagination, yet utterly convincing. The artifact's surface bore fingerprints set in dried mud, and he covered them with acid-free tissue as if tucking in a sleeper. Humidity made the rubber sigh whenever he lifted a corner, a quiet breath that startled him every time. He recorded the room's temperature, and even the scent of machine oil drifting from nearby tractors, knowing context would matter. Outside, cicadas rasped in the hedges, the summer song slipping through cracked windows to mingle with the scent of rubber ghosts. Evidence no longer lived only in stories, it now occupied a concrete floor speckled with dust. Reflection washed over him as he brushed dirt from the faux rivets, realizing that air once carried strategic weight. The armory echoed with the hollow thump of his knuckles against the shell, a reminder that emptiness had terrified an empire. River fog creeps, valves glisten, palms warm, slate-light tastes of iron. Silence taps a steady metronome, and the artifact seemed to inhale once more. The story thus looped. Wartime innovation birthed the deception. The immediate post-war period suppressed it, and this archivist's touch initiated rediscovery, like fingerprints appearing under soft ultraviolet glow. He drafted a report whose pages smelled of toner, matching oral histories with physical measurements taken from that recovered decoy. He added appendices describing the ambient temperature in the armory, the thread counts of the canvas, and the specific brand of paint identified under microscopy. He even tucked in a pressed blade of field grass he found stuck to the decoy, believing texture mattered as much as text. He felt his pulse match the creak of his chair as he typed, the rhythm steadying his excitement. During pauses, he traced imagined convoy routes into the dust on his blotter, fingers leaving faint rivers that only he could interpret. Late nights left crescent moons of graphite under his nails, a cartographer's manicure that testified to obsession. Evidence aligned across decades, showing how discovery had first occurred in French fields, then been intentionally buried, and now, through careful scholarship, re-emerged. Reflection accompanied every stapled appendix, reminding him that truth can hibernate, but rarely dies. The air in the reading room felt dry, motes swirling through sunbeams as if mirroring the resuscitated myth of armor made from breath. The inflatable army's heartbeat returned, faint yet steady, and the archivist left fingerprints of talc on the doorknob without realizing. When museums began planning exhibits, curators unrolled canvases over padded tables covered with unbleached muslin that smelled of starch and history. Conservators wore cotton gloves, their fingertips tracing the brushwork that once fooled reconnaissance pilots, documenting every crackle in the pigment. They used soft horsehair brushes to coax dust from seams, the strokes whispering like distant rain. Conservators tilted the decoys slightly to test how shadows travelled over the false rivets, making notes about visitor sightlines. Docents rehearsed whispered explanations beside them, voices softened to match the hush of the gallery. Someone always brewed a pot of cinnamon tea, the aroma mingling with the latex to create an oddly comforting bouquet. Shipping crates stacked nearby exhaled cedar and rope musk, reminding everyone that these giant props once travelled like circus wonders. Evidence of authenticity emerged in the matching of serial numbers to declassified rosters, while reflection coloured the curator's discussions about how to stage the narrative without glamorizing war. They adjusted lighting so that visitors would see the painted highlights, the scuffs, the hand-lettered numbers, and perhaps feel the cold French air imagined in the scenes. Galleries filled with soft audio of whispered radio chatter, letting modern ears taste the static. The museum became another battlefield of storytelling, honouring the invisible performers, and even the HVAC system was tuned to rustle like wind through canvas. Surviving members sat beneath studio lights for oral histories, their wrinkles catching the glow as microphones captured voices seasoned by tobacco, winter air, and patience. They described the weight of carrying inflatable struts on their shoulders, the squeal of valves, the taste of rainwater collected in helmets during all-night inflations. Some brought personal artifacts, sketchbooks flecked with mud, dog-eared cue sheets, a pocket knife still smelling of linseed oil, to show the interviewers. Interviewers often placed a piece of inflated rubber on the table so the veterans could squeeze it, awakening tactile memory. Between takes, assistants brewed chamomile tea so throats would stay warm, and the steam fogged the edges of camera lenses. Background music stayed off, replaced by the soft whir of reels and the occasional clink of ice in glasses offered for comfort. A quiet metronome clicked beside the camera to keep stories paced, and its wooden case smelled faintly of the piano benches of their youth. Evidence now flowed directly from their speech, aligning with logs and photographs unearthed earlier. Reflection punctuated their sentences. Some paused to inhale, eyes moist, as they remembered comrades who never saw recognition. The studio smelled faintly of foam panels and warm electronics, a far cry from muddy fields, yet the sensory memories they summoned made the past tactile again. Listeners leaned in, absorbing every detail, while boom microphones captured even the soft chuckles that followed bittersweet memories. Psychologists analysing the unit's tactics spread schematics across conference tables, the glossy paper reflecting overhead lights, while the smell of dry erase markers mingled with old carpet. They connected decibel levels to stress responses, citing field recordings where low-frequency rumbles triggered fear in listeners unaware of the hoax. They also piped those recordings through modern speakers, watching heart rate monitors attached to volunteers rise with every simulated convoy. Researchers dimmed the lights to mimic blackout conditions, letting participants taste the metallic tang of nervous breath as the sound swelled. Data points crawled across projected screens like constellations, and analysts traced them with laser pointers that glowed cherry red in the dim room. The hum of synchronized stopwatches added another percussion line to the experiment. They piped in low wind noise beneath the engine recordings, discovering that a single whisper of air could double a volunteer's pulse. Evidence now transcended anecdote. Data graphs illustrated how sensory overload could reroute enemy decision-making. Reflection colored their conclusions, suggesting that carefully calibrated illusions might someday serve humanitarian missions by discouraging combat altogether. Laptop fans whirred softly, and outside the window, rain ticked against glass, echoing the old generator rhythms. The modern analysis gave the Ghost Army new relevance beyond its original battlefield, and the scent of dry toner hung in the air like a reminder of paperwork still to file. Contemporary artists responded with installations that inflated translucent membranes inside galleries, their surfaces scented with latex and projected with archival footage looping like gentle breathing. Visitors walked through chambers lit by blue LEDs, hearing layered recordings of trucks, heartbeats, and whispered coordinates. Some exhibits released cool mist, letting droplets settle on eyelashes so attendees felt the damp nights described in diaries. Others handed guests small tape measures so they could mark out the phantom dimensions themselves, grounding myth in muscle memory. Visitors scribbled impressions into guest books that rustled like leaves, their pens releasing the faint smell of fresh ink. Curators noted which visitors lingered longest beneath the projections, jotting observations about posture and breathing like field notes from another war. Ushers offered earplugs perfumed with lavender for those who needed softer sound, reinforcing the bedtime aura. Evidence of the past merged with present sensibilities, as each work cited specific operations and displayed fragments of declassified sketches. Reflection overtook the viewers, who found themselves dwarfed by hollow giants that felt simultaneously protective and eerie. The floor vibrated slightly from hidden subwoofers, giving bodies a sense of marching columns that existed only as air. Thus, the inflatable army's legacy expanded into art once again, and exit doors smelled faintly of ozone after the blowers shut down. Educational programs invited students to handle replica valves and paint sample rivets under the guidance of historians who smelled faintly of newsprint and coffee. The classroom hummed with curiosity as gloved hands pressed the rubber, noting how light skated across its surface. Instructors played crackling radio clips, letting the static prickle across ears before translating the jargon into approachable narratives. They also dimmed the lights and piped in low drum beats so pupils could feel vibrations through the soles of their sneakers. Field trip buses idled outside, their diesel breath seeping in whenever the door opened, reminding everyone that travel had replaced bivouacs for these modern learners. Students compared notes on the bus ride home, the paper smelling of graphite and gum wrappers. Teachers collected the students' questions afterward, the papers rustling like leaves and smelling of cafeteria pepper as curiosity met compassion. Evidence came alive through touch, and questions bloomed about ethics, artistry, and the human costs spared by deception. Reflection filled the quiet afterward, when the students listened to recordings of veterans describing cold nights spent guarding nothing but air. The exercise made myth tangible, anchored by sensory proof. Lantern glow imagined, wool sleeves scratch, chalk dust swirls, breaths align, midnight tastes of safety promised by whispers, and the notebooks they filled smelled of pencil shavings. In 1996, a tranche of documents finally shed their secrecy stamps, the pages unfurling with a faint crackle as archivists lifted them beneath fluorescent halos. The paper carried the smell of aged cellulose and adhesive, and ink that once threatened court-martial now simply told a story. Archivists wore cotton gloves that creaked softly, turning each page with reverence akin to handling illuminated manuscripts. Some paused to snap Polaroids of the declassification notations, eager to capture the exact moment light hit the words. Security guards paused outside the reading room, sensing the excitement inside even if they did not know the subject. Night shift staff later described the lingering odour of warmed paper as proof that history itself had breathed. Archivists signed their names in blue ink on the declassification receipts, the looping signatures trembling with awe. Evidence blossomed in annexes listing equipment quantities, operation names and commendations long deferred. Reflection swept through the reading rooms as researchers realized an entire chapter of wartime creativity had been hidden within filing cabinets. Fingers traced signatures, hearts quickened, and silence in the archive shifted from suppression to reverence. Discovery resurfaced with the rustle of pages, and the overhead lights seemed warmer than before. Newspapers responded with spreads printed on coarse stock that left fingertips grey, featuring photographs of veterans standing beside reinflated decoys under soft morning light. Headlines framed the inflatable army as both prank and life-saving strategy, yet the articles grounded the narrative in interviews and technical diagrams. Reporters described the smell of the rubber as it warmed in the sun, the way it squeaked when folded, anchoring the story in present senses. Some editions even included scratch and sniff patches scented faintly of latex, a playful experiment that startled breakfast tables into sudden attention. Families clipped the stories and slipped them into scrapbooks that already smelled of paste and attic cedar. Children traced the newspaper diagrams with marmalade, sticky fingers, promising to retell the story at show and tell the next day. Cafes reported patrons lingering over multiple refills, unwilling to fold the paper until every column was read aloud. Evidence flowed into the public sphere, and readers could almost smell the rubber pictured on the page. Reflection rode alongside, as columnists mused about creativity as a form of courage. Coffee steam rose in kitchens while citizens absorbed the tale, the rustle of paper echoing the murmurs once confined to war rooms. The myth entered mainstream memory, and breakfast tables briefly resembled briefing tents. Documentary crews travelled to former battlefields, their cameras whirring softly as they filmed morning fog-hugging meadows where the Ghost Army once staged illusions. Boom microphones caught the crunch of frost beneath boots, while narrators whispered about artists who weaponized air. Producers carried small vials of soil to compare textures with archival descriptions, letting earthy scents guide B-roll selections. Drone shots drifted over hedgerows, their propellers sounding like subdued insects, and the footage layered old deception maps onto present landscapes. Dew beaded on camera lenses so often that assistants wore scarves as makeshift cloths, the droplets tasting faintly of iron when they brushed lips. On breaks, crews warmed hands around tin cups of broth, inhaling steam that blurred their view of the phantom fields. Local guides stood beside the crews, breathing into cupped hands and pointing out trees that had once hidden the pneumatic hoses. Evidence appeared on screen through overlays of maps, original sketches, and restored footage of inflations. Reflection seeped into the voiceovers, inviting viewers to imagine the taste of cold breath exhaled into hoses that birthed phantom armor. Even the soundtrack favored low hums and distant drums, replicating the sensory hypnosis that once rattled enemy nerves. The story, finally public, still moved with ASMR softness, and theatre speakers vibrated like distant engines under the seats. In villages where the deception once unfolded, elders recalled the glow of distant campfires that never crackled, the scent of rubber drifting through apple orchards, and the hush that followed sudden troop movements. Oral historians recorded these testimonies in kitchens perfumed with broth and thyme, capturing how locals sensed something uncanny yet chose silence out of respect. Some remembered finding odd footprints that ended abruptly, as if giants had stepped into the clouds, and they laughed softly while telling it. Others produced faded handkerchiefs given by American artists, the fabric still smelling faintly of charcoal and soap. Bakers now knead dough in the same rooms, saying the yeast sometimes seems livelier on the anniversaries of those phantom nights. Church bells ring softly during interviews, their echoes wrapping each story in reverent resonance. Evidence of collaboration. Loaned wagons, shared bread, warning knocks on shutters, layered the narrative with community texture. Reflection deepened as villagers compared the inflatable army to folk tales where spirits guarded the countryside. Wooden chairs creaked, teacups clinked, and memories breathed back into the air once charged with deception. The home front had been part of the illusion without knowing its name, and the smell of yeast still carried whispers of secrecy. Modern strategists now gather in conference halls scented with polished wood and projector heat, debating whether deception of this kind could operate in an age of satellites. They examine digital models, the blue-white glow painting their faces, while audio simulations thrum through subwoofers built into the floor. Tablet screens leave smudges of stylus graphite on fingertips, proof that technology still demands touch. Analysts occasionally pass around fragments of original canvas, so the discussion never drifts too far from texture. Simulations sometimes project virtual convoys across the carpet, and attendees step aside instinctively, chuckling at how convincing pixels can feel. The HVAC vents release faintly ionized air that smells a little like ozone after thunderstorms, sharpening their focus. Evidence from the Ghost Army anchors their slides, yet reflection dominates the discussions. Can compassion-driven deceit still spare lives when information spreads instantly? Coffee cups clink, pens scratch, and the arguments weave between admiration for past artistry and caution about present transparency. The inflatable army thus serves as both precedent and parable, a soft-voiced mentor reminding planners that creativity can be a shield. The room fills with the scent of ideas warming, and the HVAC hum mimics far-off convoys. Back in the archives, researchers continue to catalogue letters, their latex gloves snapping softly as they turn fragile pages scented with cedar boxes and a hint of mildew. The handwriting curls across the sheets like contrails, evidence aligning with every new annotation inked in pencil. They slide magnifying glasses over ink that shimmers like beetle wings, tracing abbreviations that once hid whole battalions. Footstools creak as they reach higher shelves, and dust tickles throats despite careful masks. They note how traces of glue still cling to paper edges where censors once sealed secrets, a sweet smell that lingers decades later. Tiny static shocks hop between sleeve and page, reminding them that even air plays along. Reflection settles between the shelves, where the air feels cooler and footsteps reverberate like distant artillery heard through pillows. The archivists whisper to maintain the sanctity of the space, aware that each syllable resurrects the soldier's careful hush. Lamps bathe the desks in amber triangles, illuminating both truth and tenderness. Breath gathers, hush thickens, paper rustles, lamp heat tastes of dust. Memory inhales, exhale returns to quiet, and dust motes orbit like planets. Therapists working with veterans sometimes use miniature inflatable models during sessions, inviting clients to paint them under soft music that sounds like distant shorelines. The acrylic paints smell faintly of citrus, and the room carries the warmth of diffused lamps. Patients dip brushes into muted greens, recreating camouflage patterns while discussing memories that surface with each swipe. Some therapists spritz a whisper of rubber scent into the air, helping the senses travel back safely. Warm tea waits nearby, steam curling like gentle signal smoke, ready for moments when voices tremble. Weighted blankets sit folded on chairs, offering grounded pressure after turbulent recollections. Evidence of healing appears in the narratives that follow, as participants describe feeling both protected and empowered by recreating the ghostly equipment. Reflection brings tears, occasionally, when someone recalls a night spent guarding a decoy that drew enemy artillery away from friends. The tactile process, the squeeze of the vinyl, the glide of brushes, connects memory to present comfort. Even in therapy, air becomes armor once more, and the tissues passed around rustle like tiny parachutes. Reenactors now inflate replicas at twilight events, their portable blowers humming while spectators sip cocoa that perfumes the cold air. Lanterns cast honeyed light onto the rising hulls, and children reach out to feel the smooth skin that once convinced spies. Volunteers sprinkle dirt across the surfaces to dull the shine, laughing as their fingertips turn brown. They also stage whispered radio drills behind canvas screens, letting visitors hear the invented chatter that once redirected armies. Portable heaters tick nearby, releasing the faint smell of kerosene that mingles with dew-soaked grass. Volunteer tailors patch tiny tears between demonstrations, the sound of needles sliding through fabric echoing the past. Evidence of authenticity appears in the meticulous spacing, the scripted radio chatter piped through hidden speakers, and the use of period-accurate pigments. Reflection touches the audience as they watch shapes swell against the evening sky, imagining soldiers relying on breath and illusion to guide history. Crickets chime, boots crunch gravel, and the crowd listens with a reverent hush seldom found at reenactments. The myth breathes in public now, gentle and vast, and the cocoa leaves a cinnamon trail on the air. Military engineers referencing the Ghost Army now experiment with inflatable radar reflectors and drone-mounted sound projectors inside hangars that smell of epoxy and ozone. Computers fan warm air across their cheeks as they model how light, heat and noise can craft persuasive disguises. They stretch thermal blankets over frames, watching infrared monitors bloom with false signatures that ripple like auroras. Engineers jot code in notebooks streaked with graphite, because even digital deception begins with graphite lines. Prototype balloons pulse under ultraviolet tests, painting the ceiling with wavering shadows. Coffee in paper cups cools beside soldering irons, the bitter aroma mingling with metallic tang. Evidence of lineage appears in the schematics, where notes cite historical tactics alongside modern sensors. Reflection tempers their enthusiasm. They recall that the original mission aimed to save lives, not simply to trick. Tool chests clang, safety goggles fog, and the hum of 3D printers echoes like distant engines. The future converses with the past through currents of charged air, and the floor vibrations feel like phantom convoys rolling by. In a climate-controlled vault, the original tape measure from that first warehouse still rests coiled beside the ledger, its cloth edge faintly perfumed with machine oil and starch. Conservators documented the faded numbers, noting where graphite smudges mark the circumference of the inflatable turret that challenged steel's supremacy. They occasionally unspool it across a foam cradle, the fabric whispering like silk as it straightens. Nearby sits the ledger whose pages rustle like distant leaves whenever someone turns them, releasing a dry scent of cedar chests. Curators breathe shallowly when handling both objects, afraid even exhalation might disturb the delicate fibers. Disposable gloves squeak softly against the cloth, a reminder that touch now requires mediation. Climate monitors blink softly on the shelf, reporting humidity in whispers so gentle they resemble the stage cues that started it all. Evidence of the myth's birth lies in that modest tool, while reflection whispers that sometimes the lightest touch shifts the heaviest outcomes. The vault's air feels cool, dryers hum softly, and the tape seems to sigh when unspooled for researchers. Measurement and legend sit side by side, inseparable, and the ledgers nearby exude the woody scent of pencil shavings trapped for generations. When formal recognition finally arrived, medals gleamed under stage lights, and the surviving Ghost Army veterans felt the velvet-lined boxes pressed gently against palms weathered by paint and rope. Applause rolled like soft thunder through the hall, mingling with the faint scent of polished brass and bouquet petals. Reporters' flashes popped like distant flares, catching tears that glimmered on cheeks. A military band played in whispers, muting cymbals with felt so the ceremony retained its bedtime softness. Medal ribbons brushed coat sleeves with a whispering rasp, and some honorees raised them to their noses, inhaling the scent of silk and metal. Ushers discreetly offered handkerchiefs perfumed with lilac, a fragrant echo of wartime letters. Evidence of their service now shimmered openly, engraved in citations read aloud with steady voices. Reflection washed over the audience as they imagined night fields, inflatable hulls swaying, and the heartbeat of men who fought with imagination. Tears traced warm paths down faces, and the medals clinked softly, like chimes acknowledging overdue gratitude. The ghosts stepped into light without losing their gentleness, and the stage smelled briefly of canvas in honor of their craft. Even now, students of history revisit the battle maps, tracing the routes where fake convoys rolled, the paper crackling softly beneath their fingertips. They overlay meteorological charts, decode radio logs, and match them to diaries that still smell faintly of mildew and pencil shavings. Some bring magnifiers to inspect penciled annotations that describe how long it took to inflate a single turret, savoring the mundane heroism hidden in measurements. Others listen to restored radio chatter through headphones, letting the static kiss their ears as they follow along on transparent overlays. Archivists share fresh scans via tablets resting beside the maps, the screens casting a cool glow on calloused hands. Nearby dehumidifiers purr, their steady breath preserving both paper and concentration. Evidence multiplies with each cross-reference, weaving a net that holds the inflatable army firmly within documented truth. Reflection keeps pace, reminding readers that courage sometimes weighs no more than a lungful of air. Lamplight pools, graphite glints, pulse steadies, dust tastes of chalk, memory hums, night leans close, assurances drift like feathers, and the page edges rustle like distant waves. From hook to rediscovery, the central motif remains the collision of measurements with myth, a tape measure, a hose, a radio dial, each tactile gauge proving that breath-sculpted dread. Scholars now speak of the Ghost Army as a layered palimpsest, discovered in war, suppressed by secrecy, rediscovered by curiosity. Its power resting not in force but in textures and tones. They cite inventories, paint analyses, weather diaries, and testimonies, letting evidence stack like carefully folded tarps within a truck bed. Conference panels now pass around replicas of valves and pigment swatches, so audiences can feel the data settling into their palms. Museum tours begin with measuring tapes placed into visitors' hands, the cool fabric reminding everyone that mathematics once masqueraded as might. Podcasts even include binaural recordings of hoses inflating, letting listeners taste the metallic air through headphones. Evidence threads through fabrics, ledgers, testimonies, and reenactments, while reflection reminds us that imagination wielded with care can reroute violence. The sensory legacy endures in the smell of rubber, the taste of cold fog, the vibration of staged engines rolling through loam. Every retelling polishes the legend without hardening it, keeping the tale as soft as the materials that shaped it. The inflatable army continues to terrify only those who trust brutality over creativity, and its whisper persists like air slipping through a valve. In the hush after midnight, picture those empty fields again, dew collecting on collapsed canvas, the earth breathing slowly, where once an army of air kept real soldiers alive. The measurements survive in ledgers, the myths still travel on the rustle of archival pages, yet some part of the story remains intangible, like the faint scent of talc receding into soil. Evidence can pin locations, list personnel, and weigh the cost saved, but it cannot fully explain why hollow skins convinced hardened observers to tremble. Reflection lingers as a low hum, suggesting that perhaps fear listens more to suggestion than to mass. You can almost hear the whisper of hoses, the sigh of deflation, the gentle slap of canvas folding into crates, each sound hinting at secrets that prefer dusk. Imagine fingertips brushing those folds, feeling the chill trapped inside, and sense how the night itself leans closer to listen. Let the soil's cool aroma mingle with distant owl cries, and notice how your own breathing begins to match the slow inflation and release. Suppose a breeze lifts a scrap of rubber and sends it skating across the grass, a reminder that air still loves to perform. Fireflies sometimes drift above those sites, their cold light pulsing like tiny signal lamps for anyone still awake. Mystery abides there, in the space between breath drawn and breath released, where the inflatable army still waits to be imagined anew, its silence tasting faintly of rain and graphite.